Hey guys, before we start, I want to be honest with you. This video is a bit of an experiment. Usually I talk about games, how they connect to life, philosophy, and the way we deal with ourselves and others, but this time, I wanted to try something different. Instead of focusing on a game, I want to talk about a series I deeply love. My goal is still the same: reflection. I want to explore stories that go beyond entertainment, stories that mirror real emotional conflicts we all face. So let me know what you think about this format. If you enjoy reflective content like this, whether it comes from games, movies, or TV series, your feedback really matters to me. That said, this video contains major spoilers for Better Call Saul. If you haven't watched the series yet and want to experience it without knowing what happens, I strongly recommend watching it first. If you choose to continue, I'll give enough context so you can still follow the discussion. Better Call Saul is a slow-burning tragedy disguised as a legal drama. It follows the transformation of Jimmy McGill, a small-time con artist with good intentions and bad habits, into Saul Goodman, the morally flexible lawyer many viewers first met in Breaking Bad. This transformation doesn't happen all at once. It happens through small decisions, repeated compromises, and emotional wounds that never fully heal. At the center of this story is the relationship between two brothers, Jimmy McGill and Chuck McGill. Chuck is a brilliant lawyer, a co-founder of a prestigious law firm, and someone who believes deeply in rules, structure, and the law as a moral institution. Jimmy, on the other hand, survives through charm, improvisation, and bending rules when they stand in his way. Chuck believes that Jimmy cannot truly change, that no matter how hard he tries, he will always look for shortcuts and eventually hurt people. And as the series progresses, many of Chuck's fears come true. Jimmy lies, manipulates, sabotages others, and slowly abandons any remaining commitment to playing fair. So the central question of this video is simple but uncomfortable. Was Chuck right about Jimmy? To ground this discussion, I want to use a different philosophical lens throughout the video: ethics and moral philosophy, specifically Immanuel Kant's concept of the categorical imperative. Kant argues that moral actions should be guided by principles that could be universalized, rules we would be willing to see everyone follow, and that people should never be treated merely as a means to an end, but always as ends in themselves. If we apply this framework to Better Call Saul, Chuck begins to look less like a villain and more like a moral absolutist. Chuck genuinely believes in rules, institutions, and consistency. He wants the law to be fair not because it feels good, but because it must be. From a Kantian perspective, Chuck often acts in ways that are logically coherent and internally consistent. However, this is where the tension begins. Chuck applies moral rules rigidly without considering the human cost. He treats Jimmy less as a person capable of moral growth and more as a problem to be managed, almost as a risk to the system. In doing so, Chuck violates a core Kantian principle: respecting the dignity of the individual. Chuck may be following rules, but he repeatedly fails to treat his own brother as an end in himself. One of the most destructive forces in human relationships is not open hatred, but quiet disbelief. Jimmy is not rejected loudly, he is doubted constantly. Chuck does not shout that Jimmy is incapable of change. He calmly assumes it. And assumptions, when repeated long enough, become cages. From an ethical standpoint, this is not a neutral act. To constantly expect moral failure from someone is to deny them moral dignity. You are no longer engaging with a person as a developing moral agent, but as a problem to be managed. Chuck's treatment of Jimmy reflects this again and again. Even when Jimmy passes the bar exam, Chuck reframes it as a fluke. Even when Jimmy works tirelessly, Chuck interprets effort as manipulation. The lie about their mother's final words is one of the most ethically revealing moments in the series. Chuck is not acting impulsively. He makes a conscious decision to withhold truth because he believes Jimmy does not deserve it. In that moment, Chuck places himself above his brother morally, assuming the authority to decide what kind of emotional truth Jimmy is allowed to receive. Kantian ethics would strongly challenge this behavior. Truthfulness is not optional, especially when the other person's dignity is at stake. Chuck's action treats Jimmy not as an end in himself, but as a variable in a moral equation. The irony is brutal. In trying to preserve moral order, Chuck commits a deeply unethical act. For many viewers, this dynamic feels painfully familiar. Being constantly doubted by someone close to you slowly reshapes how you see yourself. At some point, you stop trying to prove them wrong. Not because they are right, but because you are tired. The danger of a character like Jimmy McGill is how understandable he is. The show places us inside his frustration, his humiliation, and his desire to be seen as worthy. As viewers, we are emotionally aligned with him, but ethics demands distance where emotion demands closeness. Jimmy is not confused about right and wrong. He is strategic. He knows when he is lying, when he is manipulating, and when he is crossing moral lines. What makes his actions ethically troubling is not ignorance but intention. He repeatedly chooses effectiveness over integrity. In Kantian terms, Jimmy treats people as means to an end whenever it benefits him. Clients become income, colleagues become obstacles, relationships become tools. Even when his actions produce good outcomes, the moral violation remains, because the motivation is rooted in control rather than respect. Jimmy often uses his suffering as justification. Because he has been mistreated, he convinces himself that normal moral constraints no longer apply. This is a subtle but dangerous form of moral rationalization. Pain becomes permission. This is where the series refuses to let us off the hook as viewers. Understanding Jimmy does not mean defending him. In fact, his intelligence and self-awareness increase his responsibility. He knows better and chooses otherwise. Moral collapse almost never happens in a single dramatic decision. It does not arrive with a clear warning, nor does it feel like a conscious betrayal of who we are. More often, it happens quietly, through repetition, exhaustion, and adaptation. One small compromise becomes easier after the first, not because it is right, but because it is familiar. Better. Call Saul is a masterclass in showing how integrity erodes without ever fully announcing its disappearance. Jimmy does not wake up one morning and decide to become Saul Goodman. There is no single moment where he clearly crosses a line and loses his way forever. What happens instead is drift. And drift is shaped less by personal ambition and more by relationships. By who believes in you, who doubts you, and who silently stops expecting better from you. Chuck's distrust is the emotional center of this drift. When the person whose opinion matters most constantly reframes your efforts as manipulation, your growth as a threat, and your success as an accident, something breaks internally. Moral effort begins to feel pointless. Integrity starts to feel like a performance for an audience that has already decided how the story ends. Other forces reinforce this erosion. Howard's emotional distance, the legal system's selective fairness, and the repeated message that the rules only apply when it is convenient all teach Jimmy the same lesson. Playing fair does not guarantee dignity. Later, Kim's gradual willingness to bend rules alongside Jimmy introduces something even more dangerous: shared immorality. When wrongdoing becomes something you do together, it stops feeling like failure and starts feeling like intimacy. From an ethical perspective, this reveals a deeply uncomfortable truth. While we remain responsible for our actions, we are never formed in isolation. Our environment does not excuse our choices, but it shapes which choices feel possible, sustainable, or even worth making. When someone is treated as morally unreliable for long enough, they may eventually stop trying to be reliable, not out of rebellion, but out of emotional survival. Influence is dangerous not because it removes freedom, but because it rewrites our inner dialogue. Jimmy slowly begins to believe that honesty is naive, that moral consistency is weakness, and that bending rules is simply how adults survive in a dishonest world. At that point, immorality no longer feels like defiance. It feels like realism. Most people watching can recognize this pattern in their own lives. A relationship that slowly makes you colder, a job that rewards cynicism over empathy, a friendship that teaches you that being decent means being exploited. The drift is quiet. but the consequences last for years. Chuck McGill believes deeply in rules, structure, and moral consistency. On the surface, this appears virtuous. He sees himself as someone carrying the burden of protecting the integrity of the law, a guardian of order in a world full of shortcuts and moral compromises. From his perspective, being strict is not cruelty, it is responsibility. But ethics without empathy easily becomes cruelty disguised as principle. Chuck rarely asks who is being hurt by his decisions, only whether the rules are being upheld. In his moral framework, correctness matters more than care, and consistency matters more than compassion. Using Kant's categorical imperative, Chuck appears justified. He believes moral rules should be universal, unwavering, and independent of emotion. If everyone followed the law strictly, the system would be fair. But Kant also insists on something Chuck consistently ignores. Human beings must always be treated as ends in themselves, never merely as means. This is where Chuck's moral philosophy collapses. He does not see Jimmy primarily as a person capable of growth, error, and redemption. He sees him as a variable, a risk factor that must be controlled for the sake of institutional purity. In trying to protect the law, Chuck sacrifices the dignity of the person standing right in front of him. A morality that leaves no room for mercy, forgiveness, or moral rehabilitation is not strong, it is brittle. It cannot adapt to human weakness, and so it breaks people instead. Chuck's rigidity gives him the illusion of moral superiority, but it blinds him to his own ethical failures, including deception, emotional manipulation, and profound lack of empathy. This posture is disturbingly common in real life. People who pride themselves on being right often justify emotional neglect, harsh judgment, and even lies in the name of principle. They follow rules perfectly while violating people quietly. Chuck's tragedy is not that he values ethics, but that he confuses control with virtue. In trying to preserve moral order, he becomes morally blind and in the end, profoundly alone. Better Call Saul does not leave us without a moral verdict. If we analyze Jimmy McGill rationally, without emotional attachment, the conclusion is uncomfortable but clear. His moral compass is deeply flawed. What begins as small scams and seemingly harmless shortcuts gradually escalates into manipulation, betrayal, and actions that lead to real suffering and irreversible tragedy. By most ethical standards, Jimmy becomes what we would call a villain. And yet the series does something powerful and dangerous at the same time. It makes us sympathize with him. We follow Jimmy's entire journey. We see his effort, his desire to be taken seriously, and his repeated attempts to belong. Because we walk alongside him, his moral decline feels gradual, almost reasonable. Each wrongdoing is contextualized, emotionally justified, softened by understanding. This does not erase his guilt, but it explains why we hesitate to condemn him as harshly as we would if we only saw the outcome of his actions. What makes Jimmy's story tragic is not ignorance, but awareness. He knows right from wrong. He understands the rules he is breaking. His moral failures are not accidents, they are choices. And that is precisely why the ending of the series matters so much. In the final moments, Jimmy does something that he could have avoided. He had the opportunity to minimize his sentence, to manipulate the system one last time, to escape the full weight of accountability. Instead, he confesses, not only to what is legally provable, but to more than what is required. For the first time, he stops performing. This moment does not redeem his past, but it restores something essential: moral agency. Jimmy finally acts not to win, not to survive, and not to manipulate, but to take responsibility. In ethical terms, it is the first fully honest choice he makes. It is also important to be clear about Chuck's role. Chuck McGill is not responsible for Jimmy's actions. Jimmy is an adult, aware of his choices, and fully accountable for the harm he causes. Blaming Chuck for Jimmy's crimes would be an ethical mistake. But the series leaves us with a quieter, more uncomfortable question, one it never answers directly. If Chuck had been more supportive, more empathetic, more willing to see his brother as someone capable of moral growth? Could things have been different? That question remains open, not because it excuses Jimmy, but because it forces us to reflect on influence rather than blame. Chuck did not create Saul Goodman, but his lack of compassion may have helped shape the environment in which Saul became inevitable. And maybe that is the final lesson of the series. We are fully responsible for our actions, but we are also responsible for how we treat the people closest to us, not because we control who they become, but because our presence, our judgment, and our empathy can quietly push someone toward or away from their worst self.